Melisandre stood upon a cracked ridge overlooking the smoking ruins of a battlefield that had once been a simple meadow. The smell of charred timber and burned flesh still lingered in the air, carried on a bitter wind that whipped through her red robes. She had stood in places like this before, in countless corners of Westeros, watching the aftermath of conflict, witnessing the wrath and cruelty of men upon one another. But this time felt different. This time, the flames of war seemed to respond to her presence. In their glow, she saw the faintest flicker of something more than just heat. An answer, perhaps, to a question she had asked the Lord of Light for years. She had returned after her long exile, newly emboldened with a grand vision. The dream of a red empire that would cleanse the darkness with holy fire and bend every knee to the truth of R'hllor. She felt that truth burning in her blood, her eyes the color of embers. A fresh wind scoured the plains before her, and she drew a long breath, letting the smell of ash fill her lungs. Far in the distance, she saw the silhouettes of survivors, the broken remnants of yet another house that had once thought itself secure. They would make easy converts, or they would be offered to the flames. She remembered the day Stannis Baratheon had accepted the Lord of Light, how his commitment had proven shallow in the end, undone by the tangled politics of Westeros, the stubbornness of men who claimed they wanted salvation yet trembled at the steps they must take to grasp it. He had believed in part but not enough. He had wavered when the day demanded certainty. He had not borne the crown of promised victory because he had never fully submitted to the will of R'hllor. No, if she was to truly bring the light to this realm, she would need more than a single man's uncertain faith. She would need armies of believers. She would need to become more than an advisor to a king. She would become the living prophet of the new age, forging a dominion under the red banners of the one true God. She recalled the fires that had danced before her, the illusions of a dark future for Westeros if it continued on its lawless path. If kings and queens persisted in their illusions of power, the long night might return one day. The next darkness would be unstoppable unless the entire continent, and beyond, united under the holy flame. Then the Red Empire would stand against all. She descended from the ridge with silent steps, not quite gliding yet moving with a grace that made no sound. She no longer feared the eyes of the North, the watchers of the old faiths, or the suspicious lords of the Seven. She needed them to see her. She wanted them to tremble. In her mind, a candle of purpose grew into a roaring inferno. The time for subtlety was done. She had allowed men and women to disbelieve, to scorn her, to excommunicate her from their circles. But the illusions of humility must fade like a candle devoured by its own flame. Let them know who Melisandre was. Let them see the burning star that guided her path. She strode toward the distant forms of battered soldiers. When they saw her approach, some raised their swords and spears, others sank to their knees, knowing that they could not resist. A few recognized her red robes from earlier days, from whispered rumors and frightened stories of shadow and sorcery. "Lady Melisandre," one man croaked, face streaked with grime, a crude bandage wrapped around his forearm. He stepped closer, uncertain. "Are you a friend?" She gazed upon him, her eyes reflecting an inner radiance that defied the gloom of the day. "I bring the Lord's mercy," she said, "but only if you would serve him. Are you tired of the wars, soldier? Are you tired of losing friends, of the emptiness that follows? Step forward and accept the fire that will cleanse you." The soldier swallowed hard and glanced at his brethren. They were exhausted, orphaned by a war that had no real meaning to them, fighting for lords who barely remembered their names. How easy it was for men like these to turn to the promise of something that offered meaning. It was that promise Melisandre held in her hand. She raised a slender, pallid finger. "Come forth, and let the light of R'hllor deliver you from the night. There is no cause but his cause now." They eyed one another with a mixture of hope and dread. But these were men who had already lost everything. Land, lord, coin, purpose. When a man loses all else, faith can fill the void. One by one, they stumbled forward, some hobbling, some helping their fellows who were too weak to walk. Melisandre noted the slow, tentative flame of curiosity flickering in their eyes, and a faint smile curved her lips. She whispered words in High Valyrian, or perhaps some older tongue. The men felt the air warm around them, and the sun that had hidden behind thick clouds seemed to break through for an instant, illuminating the crimson of her robes. The soldier who had spoken first dropped to his knees. Whether it was fear or belief that drove him, Melisandre did not much care. They would all serve her, and in serving her they would serve the Lord of Light. She passed among them, touching each brow with her fingertip. "He watches," she murmured, "and he accepts your faith. You are the first to join the new legion of the Red Empire." The phrase spilled from her lips for the first time, and it felt like prophecy realized. The men repeated it in hushed voices, and she nodded, lips twisting into a patient, glowing smile. She directed them to burn their old banners, whatever tatters remained from the battered sigils of the houses they had served, and gather wood for a pyre. She told them it would be an offering of thanks, a sign of rebirth. As the orange flames roared, licking at the sky, she closed her eyes, letting the heat wash over her, feeling the power it gave her. Her illusions had new fuel. The Red Empire was no mere rhetorical fancy. It had begun, at the edge of a battlefield, with a handful of wounded soldiers and a prophet clad in scarlet. Over the weeks that followed, Melisandre guided her small band of converts eastward. She avoided major roads at first, but she was not entirely hidden. Word spread among the peasants that a red priestess traveled with soldiers at her side, that she offered warmth, healing, and acceptance to the desperate and the forgotten. Whispers spread quickly, and disaffected small folk trickled into her camp. Some came in secret, late at night, seeking not just warmth but answers. She taught them the prayers to R'hllor, the invocations to kindle their hearts with flame. She showed them the illusions in the fire, glimpses that might have been the future, or might have simply been the reflection of her will. Yet that was enough for them. She performed small miracles of healing, or so it seemed to their eyes. She would place her hands on their wounds and whisper fervent words that made their flesh tingle with heat. Often, they swore the pain vanished from their bodies. Sometimes it did. Sometimes she used potions or subtle arts that eased pain or sealed small wounds. At other times, the faithful believed simply because they wanted to. Belief, she knew, was a powerful medicine. Soon, she had an encampment of more than 100 followers. A ragtag assembly, but theirs was a growing zeal. Each night, they held services around a great bonfire. Melisandre, robed in brilliant scarlet, would stand before the flames, leading them in chanting, reminding them that the darkness was the only true enemy. They heard the conviction in her voice, saw the strange glow in her eyes, and they worshipped. Some swore they saw shadows dancing at the edges of the flames, taking the shape of great beasts or swirling flames themselves, and they claimed it was a sign of R'hllor's presence. Melisandre let them believe, for it was true, in a sense, that her illusions manifested most strongly when the fervor of her believers rose to a fever pitch. Her greatest challenge was forging discipline among them. Desperation could be shaped into faith, but it did not always yield the discipline necessary for an empire. She needed them to become not just fanatics but soldiers of the light. Thus, she enlisted a few men among them who claimed to have served in various retinues and smaller wars. She set these men the task of training the others in basic formation and the handling of arms. The old soldier she had first met, the one with the bandaged arm, revealed his name was Ephron. He possessed a stern manner and a careful mind for organization. Though he had never been more than a foot soldier, he had seen enough battle to know how to drill recruits. Under his watchful eye, these pilgrims of the Red Empire learned to march, to fight, and to die if need be. Melisandre preached that the long night had almost taken them all once before. Perhaps it would rise again if the realm continued in its petty squabbles. But under the Red Empire, they would have a chance at true unity, not bound by birth or petty lineage, but by a calling that transcended mortal institutions. In the glow of the fires, her voice rang out like a clarion call, and it wasn't long before her ranks swelled with men and women eager to feel they had joined something mightier than themselves. She led them east, for she sensed that the next step in forging the Red Empire lay across the sea. There were already temples of R'hllor in Essos, scattered among the free cities, but many of those temples answered only to the local powers, or had grown complacent in comfort. Melisandre planned to rekindle their zeal, to unite them beneath a single banner, a single prophet. She would return in force to Westeros when the time was ripe, with an army and a cause that none could withstand. Yet she faced obstacles long before reaching the coast. Brigands roamed the lawless stretches of the land, and it took several skirmishes before her flock proved capable in combat. Ephron and a handful of hardened veterans tried to shape the new recruits, but discipline came slowly. Still, each victory, however small, was seized upon as a miracle of the Lord of Light. Melisandre would stand in the center of the battlefield, her robes unsoiled by dust or blood, her red hair almost ablaze, urging her followers to stand firm, promising them that R'hllor favored the brave. Whether by trick of the wind or some deeper magic, flames often seemed to swirl around her hands when she raised them, giving her the aspect of a living torch, the heart of the fire. The brigands, superstitious as they were, fled in terror more often than not. Those that were captured were given a chance to convert or face the flames. Some chose to bend the knee to this new Red Empire, though whether their faith was genuine or mere terror was of little concern to Melisandre at the moment. Fear could be shaped into belief over time. In the wake of each battle, she saw new glimmers of devotion in her followers. They had begun calling themselves the Flameborn, a name that pleased her. It implied a recreation through the fire. They lit bonfires each night, standing in a circle around the flames, chanting ancient words from the priestess's lips, forging a communal identity that set them apart from the rest of Westeros. Rumors continued to spread. In taverns and holdfasts, the small folk whispered of a crimson woman gathering an army, promising a future free of darkness. Some laughed it off as another pretender, but others set out to find her, leaving behind the bleakness of their lives for a chance at something new. Those fleeing old feuds, starvations, or petty tyrants drifted into Melisandre's orbit, and she welcomed them all, as long as they bowed to R'hllor. Thus her following grew, and at last they reached a small harbor. The village there had recently been sacked by raiders. Old fishing boats were burned, houses reduced to blackened frames. The living inhabitants were few, but they cowered indoors. Some among Melisandre's host wanted to turn back, or to keep moving along the coast until they found a more prosperous port. But Melisandre saw a chance for a demonstration of power. She gathered her faithful around the largest ruin in what remained of the village square. She directed them to scour the area for usable lumber, to salvage what had not been destroyed. The plan was to erect a massive pyre in the center of the town as a beacon, a promise that new life could rise from the ashes. Some villagers threatened to revolt at first. They wanted no part of this foreign god's intrusion. But the Flameborn were now well-armed and numerous, and the villagers, weak from the raiders' assault, yielded to Melisandre's demands. She stepped into the charred remains of the fishing fleet, her robes trailing on splintered planks. She felt an urgent pull in her chest, as though the Lord of Light was guiding her deeper into the wreckage. She found a single unburnt boat, half sunk in the shallows, the water lapping at its sides. This mast was broken, the sail torn, but it was salvageable. She placed her hand upon its hull, sensing the faint memory of life. This vessel, with proper repairs, could carry a small crew across the narrow sea if the conditions were right. She raised her eyes to the horizon, remembering the Temple of R'hllor in Volantis, the largest and oldest of its kind. A place that could well be the cradle of a new empire if the priests there recognized her as the rightful prophet. Some part of her wondered if they would accept a woman who had once been cast out. But the flames had shown her a vision. Only in Volantis could the Red Empire claim its first true seat of power. She would bring an army of Westerosi faithful to the temple doors, a living sign that the old ways of half-belief and compromise were no more. She ordered repairs on the boat, while also commanding that a second and third vessel be found or built from whatever scraps they could muster. Many of the villagers were skilled at carpentry. Coaxing them to help required both threats and promises that they would be among the first to share in the blessings of the new order. The villagers grudgingly complied. Over weeks of labor, As the days stretched on, more pilgrims trickled into the village, following rumors of the Red Woman. Some were peasants, some outlaws with nowhere left to go, some from as far as the Reach or the Stormlands. Day by day, the throng in the battered harbor grew from a few hundred to nearly 600 souls. Tents and makeshift huts sprang up, encircling the coastline. Ephron led the new arrivals in morning drills. Even as winter's chill threatened the land, the central bonfire in the village square burned day and night. Melisandre ensured there was enough wood to feed it, though it required long treks inland to cut down trees. Few questioned why they labored so. The warmth of the flames was almost hypnotic, a living presence among them, and they believed it was R'hlloreth's favor that kept them safe from the roving bandits. Yet, Melisandre knew winter was no small foe. They needed to depart soon or risk being trapped by harsh storms and freezing winds. She organized the expedition, dividing the faithful into groups. Those who would sail with her, those who would remain behind to protect the new settlement, which she declared to be the first official stronghold of the Red Empire in Westeros. Some objected. Why remain in a ruined village? But Melisandre insisted that the presence of the Empire must not vanish from Westeros. She appointed a handful of her most devoted, among them a young woman named Miranda, to govern in her absence. Miranda had once been a septa but had converted after witnessing what she called a miracle in the flames. She had a calm strength that soothed conflicts among the pilgrims. Melisandre was confident Miranda could keep the settlement stable, training new recruits, building defenses, and ensuring that when the Red Empire returned, it would have a base of operations. The day the first boat was deemed seaworthy enough, Melisandre gathered all her followers on the shore for a final blessing. The boat, refitted with a fresh mast and painted with a blazing red sun upon its sail, rocked gently in the tide. Two more makeshift vessels floated nearby. Their hulls were patchwork, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. "The flames guide us," Melisandre said, addressing her assembled faithful. "I shall cross the sea and bring the fire of R'hllor to distant shores. Each day that passes, watch the horizon and keep your hearts alight. Soon, we shall return with new allies, new knowledge, and an unbreakable unity that will spread from these waters across all the known lands." Her words rang out with conviction. The faithful shouted in unison, "For the Lord of Light, for the Red Empire." She raised her arms, and the wind, though chill, seemed to shift as though it were carrying the heat from the bonfire behind them. She felt the intangible stir of power in that moment, the sense that she was stepping into her destiny, that the Lord of Light had cleared a path for her. She boarded the boat with a hand-picked crew, the majority of them soldiers or devoted followers who had proven their loyalty in the months past. Each of the three vessels set sail, rickety but determined. The watchers on shore continued chanting until the boats slipped from view, swallowed by the haze of the horizon. 2 days into the journey, a storm tried to claim them. The seas churned, towering waves smacking the hulls like hammers. Many of Melisandre's companions clung desperately to the rails, retching over the side or huddling under soaked cloaks. Melisandre, however, stood at the prow, her hair plastered to her face by sheets of rain, her red robes turning dark with water. She raised her hands in supplication, chanting ancient words of the Red Faith. Flashes of lightning revealed a strange sight. Each time the lightning lit her face, it seemed to glow with an inner flame, as though she were lit from within. The largest waves seemed to part or lessen just before smashing into the vessels, allowing them to survive the onslaught. One boat came perilously close to capsizing, but at the last moment it righted itself. Many believed Melisandre's prayers had tamed the storm, but even she, in the depths of her mind, felt the jaws of fear that night. She wondered if her illusions had begun to blend with reality, or if the Lord of Light truly intervened. Perhaps it was both. As the first rays of dawn broke over a calmer sea, the battered ships continued east, still afloat, the men and women aboard exhausted but exhilarated. A hush of reverent awe passed among them. They gazed upon Melisandre with renewed devotion, convinced she held true power. Days later, they arrived in the harbor of Volantis, the largest city in Essos south of the freehold's ancient seat. Its towering black walls and the long bridge thronged with people from all corners of the world. The sight made Melisandre's followers clutch their weapons warily, for here was a place of teeming humanity, not necessarily welcoming to armed outsiders. Yet, Volantis was also the home of the greatest red temple known, a sprawling marvel with high domes and pillars lit by eternal flames. Red priests in embroidered robes could sometimes be seen among the crowds, chanting or offering blessings. Melisandre had once walked among them, but she had left before forging any strong alliances, off to chase visions that led her across the sea. Now she had returned, not as a mere acolyte but as the prophet of a new empire. She guided her ragged group off the docks, ignoring the disdainful glances from city guards, the mocking calls of local traders. Some spat at their feet or hurled insults, calling them beggars or exiles. One guard demanded a toll, but Melisandre fixed him with a steady, burning stare. She did not flinch when he threatened them. She raised a single hand and said, "We come in the name of R'hllor. Stand aside, or burn in your defiance." The guard sneered, at least until the air around him shimmered with sudden heat, as though invisible flames danced at the edge of his vision. He felt a searing pain on his cheek, as if an ember had landed there, though nothing physical touched him. He stumbled back, dropping his spear. Melisandre's voice cut through the tension. "You see the truth, do you not? Let us pass." He mumbled something unintelligible, rubbing his cheek where an angry red welt had formed, and motioned for them to go on. The watchers in the crowd scattered, suddenly unwilling to test the power that the scarlet-cloaked woman seemed to possess. Thus they entered Volantis, not as conquerors but as a determined band who would brook no obstacles. Melisandre led them straight to the Temple of the Lord of Light, easily identifiable by the blazing braziers outside its tall, windowless walls. She had arranged for Ephron to keep the majority of the armed followers nearby but not to flood the temple grounds all at once, wary of alarming the local priests. Instead, she entered with only a handful of trusted disciples, stepping into the vast hall of worship. Within, the temple was lit by rows of torches and great lanterns. Shadows danced on the walls. A semicircle of priests stood at the far end, chanting in the language of old Valyria. At the center of the hall burned a massive fire, flames leaping high, fueled by some hidden mechanism. Melisandre felt the heat wash over her, and she knelt, pressing her forehead to the floor in a gesture of reverence. The other priests turned, noticing her presence. Some recognized her by the color of her robes, her foreign accent, her unearthly aura. One priest, tall and gaunt, with a shaved head and pale eyes, approached. His red robes were embroidered with gold thread in intricate patterns of flames. "Sister," he said in a voice laced with caution, "we have not seen you in many seasons. Why have you returned?" She rose smoothly, ignoring the tension in the air. "I have come with a purpose given by the Lord of Light. I bring to Volantis an army of new converts from Westeros, men and women saved from the darkness, forged into the faith by trials of war. They are the first flame of what shall become the Red Empire, uniting the known world under R'hllor's eternal fire. I seek the temple's blessing, and I offer an alliance with the other temples throughout the free cities. Together, we shall bring light to every corner of the world." A ripple of surprise passed among the priests. Some looked intrigued, others offended by her boldness. The tall priest studied her face, seemingly trying to read her soul. After a moment, he inclined his head. "Much has changed since you last walked these halls, Melisandre of Ashai. We have grown in influence, but also in caution. The world is fractious, and many powers vie for dominion. Why should we commit ourselves to your quest for conquest?" She held his gaze without flinching. "Because we are at the cusp of a new age. The old orders, the old kings, they have failed to protect the living from the spread of darkness. An empire is needed, one that acknowledges only the Lord of Light as its source of truth and power. Do you not feel it in the flames? The changes that stir, the currents of prophecy twisting through the night? I have seen it. I have felt it. We must act, or else see the world sink into endless shadow. It is only by uniting under R'hllor's banner that we can drive away the night." Her words echoed in the grand temple chamber. One could almost hear the crackling of flames in her voice. The gathered priests exchanged glances. Some murmured to one another in low tones. Finally, the tall priest motioned for her to follow him to a side chamber. 2 priests shut the door behind them, leaving Melisandre and her handful of companions alone with the temple's senior council. The chamber was smaller, filled with shelves of scrolls and manuscripts. A large brazier stood in the corner, the flames casting flickering shadows on the high ceiling. "Speak freely here," the tall priest said. "Tell us of your visions and your plan." Melisandre recounted her journey, her visions of forging an empire that stretched from Westeros across Essos, and eventually beyond. She spoke of the old threat in the north, the terror of the long night that had nearly consumed them all not so many years prior. She described how the petty rulers and faiths of Westeros had faltered. She had found pockets of devout believers, but no cohesive movement that could protect the realm from the inevitable return of darkness. She told them how R'hllor had shown her a future in the flames. A vast host of believers wearing crimson cloaks, swords blazing with holy fire, marching under a new standard that fused the sun and the flame. The priests listened, occasionally looking to one another. By the time she finished, the brazier's fire had died down to smoldering embers. The tall priest placed a log into the brazier, fanning the flame back to life, and spoke. "Your zeal is admirable, Melisandre. Yet, forging an empire, do you know what that entails? Do you think the city-states of Essos will simply bow to your revelation? And the lords of Westeros are proud. They have their own faiths, their own kings. One does not simply proclaim an empire into being." She regarded him with unwavering conviction. "I am not naive, nor do I believe this will be without challenge. But the flames show me a path. I ask that the Red Temple put its considerable influence behind this endeavor. Rally the devout among the free cities. Provide me with resources, ships, soldiers, coin. In return, I will deliver victory against all who would stand in the way of the Lord of Light's dominion." An older priestess, her face heavily lined, stepped forward. "In Volantis, we command the loyalty of many, but the Triarchs still hold temporal power. We cannot simply unleash an army in their city without cause. The other faiths, the traitors, the nobility, they watch us. If we move too brazenly, we risk inciting war here." Melisandre gave a thin smile. "Yes, but war may be inevitable. The question is how best to wage it. You know that the worship of R'hllor in Volantis grows with every day. The people tire of the Triarch's corruption, the endless power struggles, the slave markets. The small folk already revere the red priests who feed them, who heal them. All it requires is a spark, and the city will erupt in flame. Now imagine if that flame were guided, shaped, so that it did not consume indiscriminately, but instead forged a new power structure. One that set the temple at its apex." Her companions exchanged glances, sensing the tension in the room. The tall priest studied Melisandre at length before responding. "You wish to use the city's discontent to topple the Triarchs and pave the way for your Red Empire?" "Yes," she said simply. "With Volantis as our bastion, we can expand. The other cities will see that the Lord of Light is not merely a religion but a unifying power, one that can crush any opposition under the weight of divine mandate." One of her disciples, a young man named Desmond, who had once been a minor scribe in Old Town, spoke up. "We do not seek wanton bloodshed," he said quietly, "but the oppression must end. Here, as in Westeros, only the faith can bring true peace." The tall priest let out a slow breath. "I see your conviction. I also sense you are not telling us all. There is something in your eyes, Melisandre, a desperation as well as fervor. What is it you fear will come if we do not act?" Melisandre closed her eyes, recalling the half-seen visions in the flames, the shapes of monstrous shadows, the illusions that had stalked her nightmares. "It is not one thing, but many. Darkness wears 1,000 faces. Men speak of White Walkers defeated in the north, but new terrors can rise. Across the sea, warlords and dark sorceries might tear the world asunder. I do not see all ends, but I know that only the light can stand against the horrors waiting beyond the edge of sight. She reopened her eyes, letting them see the red glow in her irises. We must build a power that cannot be swept aside by any mortal or monstrous threat. Silence thickened in the chamber. Finally, the tall priest nodded slowly. Very well, you shall have our cautious support. First, we must unify the temple here in Volantis behind your cause. Some among us will resist. The high priest Bonero is old, and though he wields great power, he trusts in prophecies that do not match your own. But if you can persuade him, then you may have the might of Volantis at your side. Melisandre pressed her hands together in gratitude. Then let us speak with Bonero. I trust that the flames will guide us. It took several days of debate, ritual, and subtle maneuvering before she was granted an audience with Bonero, the most revered red priest in Volantis. During that time, Melisandre's armed followers remained in the outskirts of the city, discreetly quartered in rundown warehouses and cheap inns to avoid drawing attention. She and her companions spent long hours conferring with lesser priests, sowing the seeds of support among those who might influence Bonero's decision. Some found her vision appealing. Others suspected her of arrogance or heresy, for the Red Faith had many variants and dogmas. Still, Melisandre's command over illusions, her ability to conjure miracles around the flames, lent her an aura of the divine that could not easily be dismissed. The day came when she was finally led into Bonero's private sanctum, a vast chamber behind the main altar. The old priest sat upon a raised cushion, his eyes hidden behind heavy lids, as if he peered at the world from within a half-dream. Age had not lessened the authority in his posture. His robes were the color of fresh blood, trimmed with gold that formed writhing flame patterns across his chest. Two acolytes stood nearby, watching silently. Melisandre knelt. High Priest, I come to you with a divine purpose. Bonero's voice was a rasping whisper, but it resonated with surprising strength. I have heard many tales of you, Melisandre of Ashai, the Shadowbinder, the Red Woman who wanders far. I know of the illusions you conjure. Some call them miracles, some call them lies. Now I wish to hear from your own lips why you would claim the mantle of prophet. Do you truly believe you were chosen to unite the world under the Lord of Light? She raised her head slightly, letting him see the sincerity in her face. I do not only believe it, Your Holiness, I know it. My path has been revealed by flame and by trial. I have walked through the darkest corners of the world and emerged a servant of R'hlloreth's divine will. I stand before you not as a supplicant but as the living voice of the Red Empire, an empire that shall shine across all lands. Bonero gave a soft chuckle that sounded more like a cough. An empire. Our faith has long desired to spread beyond the confines of these walls, but rarely has the temple declared itself a seat of temporal power. Do you propose we cast aside all caution and proclaim ourselves kings? I propose we become shepherds, not kings, Melisandre answered carefully. Shepherds who lead the flock through the valley of night. The Triarchs of Volantis stand only for themselves, for gold, for indulgence. The same is true of lords, princes, and rulers across the world. They have grown fat on the suffering of the small folk, and in their corruption, they open the door for darkness to enter. Only by usurping their power, by forging a new order, can we ensure the safety and unity of all. Bonero's eyes flickered. He rested a withered hand on the arm of his cushion. Your argument is not new. Others have come before me, seeking to use the faith as a stepping stone to power. But you differ in that you have the love of the flames. You speak with conviction. I have observed the growth of the Red Faith in Westeros. A few priests have made inroads there, but nothing so grand as an empire. Yet, from the whispers in Volantis, I learn you have an armed retinue stationed in the city. Are you prepared to start a war to prove your point? She bowed her head slightly. War is regrettable but sometimes necessary. If the Triarchs stand aside and accept the Lord of Light, we need only reorganize. If they resist, then yes, we shall cast them down. The fire does not always offer gentle warmth. It can burn away the rot. Benero's gaze fell upon her scarlet robes, lingering on her jeweled choker that gleamed like a live coal at her throat. He seemed to weigh her in his mind. "I have lived many years," he said at length, "and though my eyes grow dim, I still see in the flames from time to time. They whisper of a coming age of fire, of a woman in red who might ignite the world. Whether that leads to salvation or utter destruction, I cannot yet discern." His words hung in the warm air, and Melisandre felt a ripple of uncertainty in her chest. Prophecies were never straightforward. She forced herself to project confidence. Destruction and creation are often two sides of the same coin. Sometimes the fire must consume the old so that the new can rise. Benero closed his eyes, breathing slowly. "I sense your power, and I sense your ambition." "Very well, Melisandre. I will grant you my endorsement, though I advise caution. If we are to challenge the Triarchs, we must do so swiftly and decisively, lest the city tear itself apart. The Red Temple must not be blamed for chaos we cannot control." She inclined her head. "I understand, Holy One. Let us move forward together. We shall stoke the fire carefully, but once it burns, none shall extinguish it." So began the coup in Volantis. Over a series of nights, Melisandre and her disciples met with key priests, shaping the narrative that the Triarchs were enemies of the faith, that they opposed Lawlor's rightful ascendancy. They brought in disaffected citizens, promising them food, safety, and a place in the new order. Quietly, they slipped arms to these citizens, drilling them in secret. The Triarchs, worried by rumors, sent spies into the temple district, but those spies either vanished or turned to the Red Faith under Melisandre's potent persuasion. Meanwhile, Melisandre's presence in the city became more public. She walked the streets with an escort of flame-wielding disciples. People flocked to her, some calling her Lightbringer, a title once reserved for heroes of prophecy. Each night, outside the temple, she preached to a growing crowd about the glories of the Red Empire and the doom that awaited those who clung to the old ways. The Triarchs tried to dismiss her as a zealot, but as her influence swelled, so did their alarm. They demanded Benero exile her, but the high priest played a careful game, telling them that Melisandre was merely another devotee, that the temple did not control her actions. Suspecting duplicity, the Triarchs increased their guard, deploying soldiers around the palace and along the long bridge. Tensions rose like steam in a sealed pot. The slightest spark would trigger an explosion. Melisandre, with her gift for conjuring illusions, knew how to provide that spark. Under cover of darkness, she orchestrated a staged event, an assassination attempt on one of the Triarchs by masked men claiming fealty to the Red Faith. The attempt was foiled, but not before the Triarch's guards cut down several assassins, who were in fact volunteers from among Melisandre's radical followers. The Triarch, enraged, declared war on the temple, ordering his guards to seize the Red Priests responsible. This was the pretext Melisandre needed. She spread word through the city that the Triarch had attacked worshippers at the temple, spilling faithful blood. Outraged citizens began to riot. The temple's warriors, many of them newly recruited, moved swiftly through the streets, capturing key points and clashing with city guards. Benero, though officially calling for peace, privately authorized the priests to defend the temple by any means. In truth, the Triarch's overreaction had sealed his fate. Melisandre stood on the steps of the temple, watching as mobs of armed citizens converged, chanting, "R'Lawlor! R'Lawlor!" The city was aflame with anger and chaos. Smoke curled into the night sky from burning shops and mansions. The Triarch's forces tried to hold the palatial district, but more and more guards deserted to the Red Faith side, their loyalty purchased by promises of wealth and status in the coming regime, or else fueled by fear of the fanatic crowds. By dawn, the Triarch's palaces were besieged. Melisandre led a column of her western soldiers, who had hidden in the city until now, joining the local recruits in an all-out assault. The Triarch's final loyalists fought fiercely, but the tide had turned. Melisandre advanced through the gates, the flames of burning siege towers reflecting in her eyes. She felt as though she moved in a dream, each step guided by the flames. Her illusions wove about her, making her seem taller, the air around her shimmering with impossible heat. The defenders fell back, some dropping their swords to kneel in surrender, trembling in the presence of a woman they believed to be touched by a god. In the throne room of the chief triarch, marble columns soared above. The triarch, a gaunt man swathed in fine silks, clutched a jeweled dagger with shaky hands. He tried to speak, but words failed him. Ephron disarmed him effortlessly. Melisandre gazed at the triarch without pity. You had your chance to embrace the light. You chose darkness instead. He collapsed to his knees. Mercy, he croaked. She considered him for a moment. Then, in a voice that reverberated through the throne room, she pronounced, R'hllor accepts only true faith. Your life stands as an obstacle to the dawn of a new age. She signaled, and 2 of her followers seized the triarch, dragging him away. Before the day was out, his body and that of the other triarchs were offered to the flames, a grim sacrifice that further cemented the Red Temple's ascendancy. Some in the city recoiled at the brutality, but many welcomed it, convinced that the tyranny of the old regime had ended, replaced by the righteous rule of the Lord of Light. By noon, the Red Faith had effectively conquered Volantis. Benero, though frail, was carried to the main square, where he declared a new order. The city would henceforth be governed by the faithful in the name of R'hllor, and all who wished to live in peace must swear allegiance to the Red Temple. Commerce would continue, but the slave market would be reformed under the direction of the temple, with promises that the faith would eventually end slavery altogether, a goal that had been whispered about for decades but never realized. Now, with martial force behind the temple, it stood a chance of becoming reality. The city's wealthy merchant lords grumbled, but they knew better than to resist openly. The revolution had arrived, and Melisandre was at its helm. For her role, she was given a seat of prominence in the new ruling council. Indeed, many saw her as the real power behind the throne. She spent the following weeks stabilizing the city, ensuring that chaos did not consume them. The Red Temple's forces, augmented by her Western recruits, patrolled the streets, quelling looting and punishing those who claimed the revolution gave them license to commit atrocities. Melisandre insisted that the victory must be as pure as possible if the people were to love the Red Empire. She personally oversaw the burning of criminals, turning their execution into public ceremonies of purification. Many watched with both fear and fascination. Some claimed to see the criminals' souls consumed by holy fire, wailing in the swirl of black smoke. Whether illusions or genuine spiritual displays, the effect was the same. The populace became ever more convinced that the Red Faith held a power both wondrous and terrifying. One early morning, standing atop the highest terrace of the temple, Melisandre stared out over Volantis, the sprawl of rooftops, the serpentine long bridge, and the muddy waters of the Rhône beyond the harbor. Smoke lingered in the air from the recent battles, but new fires also burned in braziers as symbols of the city's devotion. Red banners with the sign of the flame fluttered from the walls that once bore the Triarch's sigils. She inhaled, letting the heat from the rising sun caress her face. This was only the beginning. Volantis would become the jewel of the Red Empire, the proving ground for her dream. If she could hold the city, unify it under one faith, she could then look to the other free cities, and eventually return to Westeros with an armada. But she knew the road ahead was fraught. The other Red Temples might not wholeheartedly accept her self-proclaimed title as prophet. The free cities might unite against this new threat to their independence. Mercenary companies could be hired to retake Volantis in the name of old power. Westeros itself was still divided among different faiths, with lords who would not easily yield to a foreign religion. Even within Volantis, there were factions eager to undermine her. Still, she had come too far to waver now. She could almost see the future in the haze above the city. A line of ships bearing crimson sails, crossing the sea to Westeros, welcomed by the faithful who had grown in secret in her absence. She saw bonfires on every shore, a great chain of flame uniting distant lands. The vision gave her strength, igniting her blood. She whispered a prayer to the Lord of Light. Let me be your vessel. Let the world burn with your truth. Below, her followers began to chant the morning rites, their voices rising in a haunting melody. The first rays of the sun lit the city's spires, painting them gold and red. Melisandre spread her arms wide, as though to embrace it all. The Red Empire was no longer a whisper in the flames. It was alive, pulsing with fervor, ready to expand. The grand experiment had begun. Now she must keep stoking the fires. She must ensure that no shadow of doubt, no flicker of rebellion, could snuff out the flame of her cause. Volantis had fallen to her will. The next city would be easier, and then the next, until Essos recognized her dominion. Then, only then, would she return to Westeros in overwhelming strength, to sweep away the last vestiges of old power and old faiths, and crown herself or another figurehead of her choosing. As the champion of the light, she was no mere kingmaker now. She was an empire builder, the prophet of the Lord of Light. As the chants soared, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth envelop her. She felt the call of flame in her blood, and she answered it, certain that her destiny was to change the world forever. Among the swirling shadows cast by the rising sun, a single question remained. In forging her Red Empire, would Melisandre guide humanity to salvation, or would the fires of her ambition consume the entire realm? She did not know. The flames revealed many possibilities, but she had chosen her path. Her illusions, her power, and her faith would carry her forward. And all of Essos, all of Westeros, would soon discover whether the dawn she promised was a radiant new beginning, or a conflagration that would swallow them all. In the weeks following the triumph in Volantis, Melisandre rose each dawn to survey the city as it glimmered under the newly hung banners of the Red Empire. Crimson cloth bearing a stylized sun aflame flapped from watchtowers and temple spires, claiming the skyline. Below, the streets, still dusty with the rubble of conflict, teemed with a potent mix of fear, anticipation, and fervor. Mobs that had once rioted in the name of freedom or vengeance now cheered any procession of red-robed priests that passed by, waiting for guidance, waiting to see if this new regime would truly change their lives or only replicate the old injustices under a different name. Melisandre's room in the upper levels of the temple was sparse, reflecting her ascetic origins in Ashai and the discipline she had honed through her years of service to R'hllor. A single window overlooked the city's long bridge, the lifeblood of Volantis' commerce. From here, she could see lines of people crossing at all hours, some bearing carts of produce, others weighed down by the worries of an uncertain future. Soldiers of the Red Empire, newly organized into official squads, patrolled on either end of the bridge. By day, they kept close watch for signs of rebellion. By night, their torches created flickering halos of light on the ancient stones, as though to ward off the darkness. After the city's fall, the Red Temple Council had named a small ruling body to govern Volantis, with Bonero as its spiritual head and Melisandre recognized as the Lord's Hand, a title proclaiming her as the active arm of R'hllor's will. Though Bonero was revered, his advanced age and frailty meant that most of the city's day-to-day decisions fell to Melisandre and the younger priests who had allied themselves with her vision. Over time, it became evident to nearly everyone that she was the true power in Volantis. Some welcomed this openly, others grumbled in the shadows. Her first challenge was to ensure that the revolution did not devolve into chaos. Hundreds of people had joined the mob that toppled the Triarchs, and not all were motivated by faith. Some sought to profit from anarchy, looting wealthy estates or extorting bribes from traders. Melisandre acted swiftly, instructing her most disciplined soldiers and priests to arrest those who used the name of R'hllor as a shield for common banditry. Public burnings, grim and spectacular, took place in the main square at dusk. No small number of watchers felt conflicted, revolted by the spectacle yet transfixed by Melisandre's presence each time she intoned sacred prayers over the pyres. Fire turned criminals into ash, and the city's underbelly was forced to retreat or accept the new order. Over the roaring flames, Melisandre's voice would ring out, promising that the fire cleansed sins, that these sacrifices spared the city greater darkness. The watchers bowed their heads, half in fear, half in awe. Yet the deeper problem in Volantis was its entrenched slave market. Slavery formed a cornerstone of the city's economy, and the uprising had rattled that structure. Melisandre's rhetoric had called for an end to oppression, for forging a community of the faithful where no one knelt except before the Lord of Light. But it was one thing to pronounce lofty ideals. It was another to disrupt the entire social and economic order overnight. The wealthy merchant houses and the old aristocracy, some of whom had quietly supported the revolution in hopes of toppling the Triarchs, now demanded concessions. They argued that if Melisandre and Bonero dared abolish slavery outright, chaos would follow. The fields and farmlands surrounding Volantis relied on forced labor, as did many of the city's workshops. Freed slaves, though they might rejoice initially, would have little means to support themselves if the entire system collapsed in a single stroke. The merchant houses insisted that it was too late to change, that slavery was woven into the very soul of Essos. Melisandre's advisors, especially the more moderate priests, urged caution. To strip the city of its economic foundations might threaten the Red Empire's nascent power. If the peasants starved, if trade dried up, dissatisfaction would surge against the temple. Yet there were priests among the faithful who insisted that the Lord of Light demanded the end of all bondage, that the Red Empire's moral authority depended on upholding that promise. Melisandre stood at the center of this storm, forced to chart a path that combined faith with pragmatism. Late one evening, she convened a gathering of key priests, merchant representatives, and respected city elders in a torchlit hall on the temple's western side. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting swirling flames devouring serpents, an image symbolizing the triumph of R'hllor over darkness. Ephron stood near Melisandre's seat, silent but ever watchful. Miranda, the young woman once a septa in Westeros and now an ardent devotee of the Red Faith, had arrived from the new settlement across the narrow sea to serve as Melisandre's aide and liaison, bringing word that more Westerosi volunteers trickled into the settlement every week. The tension in the hall was thick enough to taste. A stout merchant in a fine yellow robe spoke first, his voice quavering with a mix of fear and self-importance. "We have supported your revolution, gave coin, lent men, and now our warehouses sit idle. The slaves see the red banners and think themselves free. Production has ground to a halt. If you do not restore order, the city will starve, and your Red Empire will collapse before it begins." Miranda raised her chin. "And you think the solution is to put chains back on every man, woman, and child who labors in your fields? Better chains than chaos," the merchant retorted. "Better that than see all go hungry." Soft murmurs of agreement drifted from some of the older aristocrats. Melisandre surveyed them, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "Are you not men of faith now, sworn to serve the Lord of Light? Did you not promise to accept his judgments if he delivered Volantis from the Triarchs?" Some of the merchants shuffled their feet. "Yes, but R'hllor demands we keep the city alive, does he not? With no labor, we produce no grain." Melisandre let the silence stretch before replying. "The light reveals that which is hidden in darkness. Here is the hidden truth. You fear not the end of your way of life, but the end of your profits. You have grown fat on the backs of those you call property. Shall we cling to that darkness because it is comfortable?" An older priest, wearing a simple red robe without adornment, cleared his throat. He was known among the faithful for his measured views. "If we release all the slaves at once, we risk a flood of homelessness, disease, and unrest. Not all can find employment or land, not so suddenly. Many will turn to crime or starve. The city is not prepared to manage such a massive transformation." Bonero listened from his cushioned seat, occasionally nodding in silent agreement with different points. His voice cracked the hush. "The Lord of Light instructs us to bring people from darkness into the light. We must end the cruelty of forced servitude. But how we do so matters. If we fail to maintain stability, the city could slide into anarchy. Then no one is free." Melisandre weighed his words. She glanced at Ephron, who remained stoic. She looked at Miranda, who gave the slightest nod, reflecting her support for a stance that balanced faith and patience. Melisandre rose to address them all, her voice low but carrying across the hall with a resonant clarity. "Then let us proceed step by step. Slavery as you have known it in Volantis will be declared ended. No new slaves shall be bought or sold on pain of death. The slave markets will close at once, and the branding of new slaves is forbidden. As for those already in chains, they shall be considered thralls in transition. We will pay them wages, meager at first perhaps, but enough to ensure they have means to buy or trade for food. In time, we shall fully integrate them into the city's workforce. One of the merchants blanched. Pay them? With what coin, if our storerooms lie empty? And who sets these wages? Melisandre's gaze sharpened. We have seized considerable wealth from the Triarch's treasury. That coin will be used to float the new system. There will be rationing at first. It will be hard work, but you, the merchant houses, stand to profit in the long run if the people are united under the Red Empire. Shall we not spread trade beyond Volantis to the next city we liberate? This mention of expansion drew uncertain glances, but Melisandre did not elaborate. Instead, she pressed on. You will accept the temple's oversight in this matter. Priests will ensure fair distribution of resources and mediate disputes. No thrall may be sold off or punished without temple review. Those who break the rules face the flames. The threat of the flames was a potent deterrent, and it hushed any further outspoken protests. After hours of debate, the assembled parties grudgingly accepted a plan of gradual emancipation. Behind closed doors, it was clear that many of the aristocrats still chafed at the notion of paying their former property. But the presence of armed Red Empire soldiers in the streets left them with little choice. When the meeting ended, Bonero approached Melisandre with a tired smile, resting a shaky hand on her arm. The road is difficult, yet you steer the city wisely. Melisandre bowed her head. Only with the Lord's guidance, Holy One. We must be careful. Too swift a stroke, and we lose stability. Too slow, and we betray our mission. Bonero nodded, his eyes distant. Yes, and we must be watchful for enemies beyond these walls. You have ignited a flame that can be seen across Essos. Many will try to snuff it out. Word of the Red Empire's takeover spread fast, carried by travelers, traders, and refugees. In Pentos, in Lys, in Tyrosh, merchants gossiped about the triumphant priestess in Volantis who had toppled the Triarchs and was dismantling the slave markets. In Myr and Norvos, lords and priests alike debated the meaning of this new militant faith. Some saw it as a threat. Others, especially those under the sway of local Red priests, viewed it as an opportunity to cast out old rulers. The Red temples in other free cities were not necessarily unified in dogma. Some looked to Volantis's high temple for direction. Others had forged local alliances with city magistrates. Now, all eyes turned to see if Melisandre would press her advantage. She did not wait long before making her next move. She sent envoys, trusted priests and skilled negotiators, to the nearest Red temples in Lys and Myr, carrying letters proclaiming that the Lord of Light had anointed Volantis to lead a new age. The letters invited the Red priests in those cities to recognize the authority of the Volantine Temple and to urge their rulers to join the Red Empire peacefully. Great concessions were promised in exchange for swift submission. Freedom of worship for all, guaranteed trade routes, mutual defense. But underlying the polite words was a clear ultimatum. If they refused, the same fate that befell the Triarchs might await them. While the envoys journeyed, Melisandre focused on fortifying Volantis's hold on the surrounding territories. A robust chain of watchtowers was organized along key roads, each manned by a squad of flame-born soldiers. Her original cadre of Westerosi converts plus new recruits from Volantis who had proven their faith and reliability. Though Ephron led most of the training, Melisandre frequently visited the camps, using her presence to inspire near-fanatical devotion. Soldiers who had once fought only for coin found themselves enthralled by the notion of defending the holy city of R'hllorès Empire. After sunset, she would hold torchlit ceremonies, chanting in High Valyrian, weaving illusions among the flames so that each soldier felt as though the fire itself gazed back at them, appraising their worth. In the days that followed such ceremonies, discipline soared, and desertions all but vanished. Despite her successes, the nights brought her little rest. Visions haunted her. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw shapes that might have been armies gathering under different banners. Wolves, lions, krakens, dragons, or perhaps illusions of old houses in Westeros. She saw shadows creeping across the seas, devouring ships in watery silence. She saw flickers of pale, undead faces, or shapeless horrors writhing in the corner of her vision. Often she would awake with a gasp, the taste of ashes in her mouth, uncertain whether the images were prophecies or mere nightmares. Each time, she rose to pray before the brazier in her chamber, stoking its flames until they flared with a vivid, unnatural glow. She would peer into those flames, whispering, "Show me the truth." But the truth refused to crystallize. She sensed only that time was short. If she did not move swiftly, some lurking darkness would gain the upper hand. Within a month, her envoys returned bearing mixed news. The priests in Myr had shown interest. They were numerous and fairly influential, but the ruling magisters there had not committed to any alliance. They seemed content to wait and see if Volantis would overextend itself and collapse. The temple in Lys, on the other hand, had a weaker influence, overshadowed by the city's pleasure houses and merchant princes who thrived on slavery and decadent trade. That temple had politely rebuffed Volantis's invitation, claiming neutrality in temporal matters. The Lyseni seemed keen to preserve their own luxuries without interference. Melisandre recognized the precarious path ahead. To the east lay many cities that might be persuaded to join through faith or fear, but to the west, across the narrow sea, lay Westeros, a land she still believed must one day be brought under the banner of R'hllor if the world was to stand firm against the threatened darkness. Yet Westeros would not yield easily. The Seven, the Old Gods, the Drowned God, and other faiths still held sway among the populace. Moreover, the great houses, whatever remained of them in the aftermath of the wars, would see an invading religious empire as a common enemy. She recalled with bitterness how the lords and ladies of Westeros had scorned or underestimated her in the past. This time, she intended to approach with overwhelming strength. But for that, she needed more than Volantis. She needed a coalition of red temples, a fleet of ships, and a disciplined army that spanned the length of Essos. She gathered her inner circle, Ephron, Miranda, several priests loyal to her cause, and a few hand-picked captains among the soldiers. Within the temple's strategic chamber, a vast room lined with old maps. Most were incomplete or outdated, but they allowed a rough sense of the continent's geography. Candles in red glass holders cast elongated shadows over the parchment as Melisandre pointed to Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh in turn. "Myr is our best option for expansion," she said. "Their red temple is strong, and the city's rulers are known to squabble amongst themselves. If we can win the local priests fully to our side, we might sway the populace, and in turn, the magisters." Ephron, arms crossed over his broad chest, asked, "And if they refuse?" Melisandre's gaze hardened. "Then we must consider how to force them. But first, we will try persuasion. War should not be our first choice if a city can be brought peacefully under the flame. After Myr, we might look to Tyrosh. Lys, however, will likely need more than words. They are too decadent, too reliant on their wealth and the slave trade." One of the priests, a tall man with a thin face named Varno, stroked his beard. "If we take Myr, we gain skilled craftsmen, weaponsmiths in particular, and expand our supply lines. Tyrosh and Lyswa would lose a strong trading partner, which might pressure them to accept terms." Miranda nodded. "But we must be wary of the Sellsword companies. Myr is famous for hiring mercenaries at a moment's notice. If the magisters feel threatened, they might pay the Golden Company or the Second Sons to resist us." "Then we pay them more," Ephron muttered. "Or make it clear that to fight the Red Empire is to fight the Lord of Light himself. That should give even battle-hardened killers pause." Melisandre considered Ephron's words. "Mercenaries follow gold above all. We can offer them position in our legions, a share of the spoils, and the Lord's blessing, if they will swear fealty to the Red Faith. Failing that, they will learn that fire is not an enemy to be trifled with." That night, messengers set out to Myr with formal proposals, while a second group was dispatched to hire or subvert mercenary captains who might otherwise be recruited against the Red Empire. Melisandre's vision extended to forging an unstoppable force, a holy army that revered Rulalar and was lavishly equipped and trained. From among the ranks of the Volantene faithful, a new officer corps emerged. Some were skilled in swordsmanship, others in tactics. A handful even dabbled in the arcane arts, studying under lesser-known shadowbinders or red priests who specialized in illusions and small pyromancies. Rumors spread in the city that the Red Empire was nurturing an elite sect of Fire Knights, though Melisandre had not formally bestowed such a title. She did, however, encourage these hush-hush experiments, believing that the illusions and partial sorceries might one day shape the battlefield in her favor. Meanwhile, the question of who truly ruled Volantis began to surface. Officially, the new city council, composed of priests, merchants who had converted or pretended to, and a few representatives of freed thralls, was meant to decide policy. But Melisandre's will guided every crucial choice. She strove to maintain the appearance of shared governance, aware that outward tyranny would spark revolt. Therefore, she visited small folk gatherings, presided over distribution of temple-funded rations, and performed conspicuous acts of charity. Healing the sick as best her illusions and rudimentary arts allowed, blessing newborns, ensuring the plight of thralls was seen as a priority. In truth, her direct magical healings were limited, but the aura of miracles lingered about her, and rumor magnified small wonders into grand events. On several occasions, she and her priests used their knowledge of herbs and potions to cure minor infections or ease fevers, enough that the people came to believe her presence could banish death itself. Even those who doubted her powers feared the fanaticism of her followers. The Red Empire's hold on Volantis grew firmer by the day. Not all was smooth. Internal factions within the temple occasionally balked at her pace of reforms. Some conservative priests saw the mass militarization and the partial abolishment of slavery as too disruptive. They muttered that Melisandre risked the wrath of the city's old families, who might still have hidden resources to raise an insurrection. Others whispered that she was building a cult of personality, overshadowing even Bonero. Indeed, more often than not, the people chanted her name during public ceremonies, calling her Lightbringer or the Queen of Ashes and Fire. Melisandre dismissed the more flattering titles, insisting the only true king was Rulalar, but it was impossible to quash the fervor. The common folk needed a symbol, a living champion of the god they now looked to for salvation. In the midst of such tensions, a woman arrived at the temple gates. A red priestess from the distant city of Ashai, the rumored land where Melisandre had received her earliest training. Draped in robes of darkest crimson, with her face hidden beneath a hood, she called herself Mokori. She claimed to have traveled for months, following whispers of the Red Woman who topples empires. At the temple steps, she knelt before Melisandre, then rose with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of her journey. "I have seen you in the flames," Mokori said in a low voice that echoed in the hush of the courtyard. "The fires burn bright around you, revealing a path of conquests and perils. My teachers in Ashai sent me to offer counsel, to ensure that the balance of shadow and light remains in your favor." Melisandre studied Mokori. In the flickering glow of the temple braziers, the newcomer's eyes seemed as black as obsidian, catching the reflection of the fire in eerie pinpricks of red. A kinship stirred in Melisandre's blood, as though she recognized an echo of her own past. "Welcome, sister," she said softly. "We have much to discuss." Inside the temple halls, they spoke at length. Mokori described certain arts learned in Ashai, knowledge forbidden to most. She hinted at the existence of shadowy powers that would relish the chance to corrupt a rising empire. Melisandre recognized the half-veiled references. Curses that thrived on fanaticism, illusions that could turn entire armies against each other. It was the same dark undercurrent that she had sensed in her nightmares. They were kindred spirits in many ways, but Melisandre also sensed an uneasy caution in Mokori. Perhaps the woman had come not merely to assist but to watch, to gauge whether Melisandre's cause aligned truly with Rulalar or with some twisted ambition. Nevertheless, Melisandre welcomed her presence, seeing in Mokori another potential ally, or at least a check against unseen dangers. That night, as they peered into the largest brazier in a secluded chamber, chanting in the old tongues, the flames danced higher than usual, casting bizarre shapes on the walls. For a fleeting instant, Melisandre thought she saw a massive black wave swallowing a coastline lined with red banners, while overhead, a sky of swirling ash blotted out the sun. She smelled salt and smoke. Then the image vanished. Mokori drew a sharp breath, murmuring something about the old powers that slumber beneath the seas. Melisandre's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She wondered if these were glimpses of a future war. Not only men battling men, but the forces of nature, of elemental darkness, rising against them. Once again, she steeled herself. She had no choice but to continue. If the world was truly on the brink of destruction, the Red Empire might be the only shield that could stand against it. In the following weeks, the response from Myr arrived. The Magisters had assembled a diplomatic party and were sending envoys to Volantis, purportedly to discuss trade agreements and the possibility of a mutual defense pact. Most believed this was a delaying tactic, a chance for Myr's elite to gauge the Red Empire's true strength firsthand. Nonetheless, Melisandre prepared to receive them with all the pomp and confidence befitting a nascent power. She arranged for a carefully choreographed welcome. Lines of flame-born soldiers in polished armor, brilliant red standards waving above them, and the city's freed thralls cheering from the streets. The newly minted guard captains took their positions under Ephron's watchful eye, determined to present an image of disciplined might. When the Myrish envoys arrived by ship, they were greeted with a spectacle. The harbor's piers decorated with crimson ribbons and great braziers ablaze, casting an orange radiance across the waters at dusk. The Myrish party, led by a slender man named Solaro di Lento, was visibly impressed. With measured politeness, they proceeded through the city's main avenue, flanked by an honor guard. Curious crowds peered from alleyways, some whispering prayers to R'hllor, others simply gawking at the foreigners who might determine whether Volantis would be forced into another war. Solaro was shown into the temple's grand hall, where Melisandre waited upon a raised dais beside Bonero. Incense burned in sconces, giving the air a perfumed thickness. As the envoy approached, he bowed deeply. Melisandre inclined her head in return, gesturing for him to speak. He wasted no time, launching into a speech about Myr's proud history of independence, its appreciation for religious freedom, and its interest in forging closer ties with Volantis. The subtext was clear. Myr was wary of outright conquest but open to concessions if it secured them a favorable position. Once he finished, Melisandre rose, her scarlet robes trailing in a whisper against the polished floor. "Envoy of Myr, we are pleased you have come. Volantis stands reborn under the light of R'hllor, casting off the shadow of the Triarchs. Our city flourishes with new faith and new order. We invite Myr to join this Red Empire, to accept the guidance of the Lord of Light, that both our cities may prosper in harmony." Solaro responded smoothly, "The Magisters of Myr have no desire to impede your sacred mission. They recognize the value of a strong alliance. Yet they must ensure their own traditions remain intact. Myr's economy is rooted in craftwork, trade, and certain long-standing institutions. It would be unwise to disrupt that balance too abruptly." He spoke as though treading on hot coals. Melisandre allowed a thin smile. "Indeed, we do not ask that Myr discard its identity. Only that you recognize the authority of the Volantine Temple, allow our priests to preach openly, and refrain from any practice or trade." Here her eyes flickered knowingly. That directly conflicts with the doctrines of the Red Faith. Solaro's lips parted in a careful smile. "Of course, I am sure the Magisters would be more than willing to accommodate." In the ensuing days, the Myrish delegation toured Volantis. They saw the lines for ration distribution, spoke to newly freed thralls laboring in fields for wages, met with merchants who grumbled about the changes, but mostly behind closed doors. They observed the disciplined patrols of the Flameborn. Some of them even attended a nighttime ritual at the Temple Plaza, where Melisandre led a rousing sermon before a towering pyre. By the end, many of the Myrish were rattled. What they had taken for rumor, an empire grounded in fanaticism, turned out to be real. Yet they also saw a city functioning with a surprising unity of purpose. If they rejected Volantis outright, they might face an army of zealots who believed their cause was ordained by a god. Solaro privately confided in Melisandre that Myr was divided into factions. Some wanted open trade with Volantis to gain access to its markets, while others preferred to hire mercenaries and push back any attempt at religious intrusion. Melisandre offered a simple solution. Let your magisters see reason. If they ally with us now, we will protect their trade routes and respect their local governance, provided they acknowledge R'hllor as the principal faith in Myr. We can arrange the presence of red priests in your city council. Myr will flourish under our banner. In reply, Solaro hesitated. And if some magisters refuse? She did not blink. Then you will deliver them this warning. The night is long and full of terrors for those who deny the light. When the Myrish departed, Melisandre gave them small parting gifts, intricately carved statuettes of a flame rising above a sun. Each statue was said to be blessed, and Solaro accepted them with forced graciousness. Watching the delegation leave, Ephron approached her. Do you trust them? Melisandre's gaze followed the Myrish as they vanished down the main avenue. They are men of politics and profit. They will seek the best bargain. If they see us as unstoppable, they will yield. If they sense weakness, they may ally with others to contain us. We must show them that our flame cannot be quenched. While the negotiations with Myr hung in the balance, Melisandre pushed forward with other tasks. She expanded the city's navy by commandeering and refitting old Volantene war galleys left in disrepair under the Triarchs, oversaw the clearing of farmland to plant new crops, to stave off food shortages once ration stores ran low, and encouraged the more devout priests to intensify their outreach. Public processions through the city became a near-weekly event, culminating in displays of fire magic, small illusions meant to represent the unstoppable blaze of the Red Empire. The spectacle thrilled many citizens, solidifying their loyalty, even as it terrified the wealthy and powerful who still remembered the purges that claimed the Triarchs. Time slipped by and the city found a tenuous equilibrium. Freed thralls gained some measure of stability, some even opening modest businesses under the temple's patronage. Merchants who opposed Melisandre's reforms found ways to coexist or quietly fled to other cities. A wave of new converts from surrounding villages and towns streamed in, lured by tales of a city reborn under sacred fire. They saw it as a haven, less because it was a paradise, more because it offered a unifying belief that promised better days. Among them arrived more soldiers willing to take up arms for the Red Empire, their loyalty forged through zeal rather than gold. Yet beyond Volantis, the currents of tension gathered force. Reports trickled in of the Golden Company hiring on with Lys. Agents in Tyrosh noted that city's leaders had begun fortifying their walls and forging alliances with mercenary bands. It seemed that not all the free cities wanted to see Volantis ascend again, red flag or otherwise. The memory of Volantis's ancient empire under the Tigers was still in living memory for some, and that empire had once tried to subjugate the entire lower region of Essos. One afternoon, as Melisandre and Mokori conferred in a private garden within the temple, a frightened acolyte ran in to report that a group of Lyseni ships had been spotted at sea, possibly heading north around the Cape. No one knew if they were coming for war or trade, but the rumor of Lyseni hiring the Golden Company cast a grim shadow. Melisandre absorbed the news calmly. She turned to Mokori. This is how it begins. The powers that cling to the old ways will unite against us. Mokori, her hood down in the privacy of the garden, showed a face lined with subtle tattoos that glimmered in the sunlight. If Lys is mustering forces, it means they see you as a threat. They may strike Myr first, hoping to cow its magisters into rejecting any alliance with you. Or they might strike directly at Volantis if they have the strength. But to do so, they risk open war. Melisandre touched the withered rosebush by her side, the brittle branches snapping between her fingers. So be it. If war is forced upon us, we will not shrink from it. We must be ready. Within days, as final negotiations with Myr hung by a thread, an urgent messenger arrived from that city. The news was dire. Lys had indeed reached out to Myr's magisters, promising mutual defense against the Volantene zealots. Several magisters once inclined toward Melisandre's offer had wavered. Now, Mir hovered on the brink of an alliance with Lys, which would effectively isolate Volantis. In a single stroke, the Red Empire could lose its best chance of peaceful expansion. After receiving this news, Melisandre gathered Ephron, Miranda, Mokori, and a few trusted generals in the temple's strategic chamber. A hush fell. Candles burned low, turning the map's parchment edges sooty. Melisandre's voice cut the silence. The hour of decision is upon us. Mir must choose. Stand with us or be consumed by the forces that would keep it in darkness. We will send a final message. Surrender to the flame or be swallowed by it. Ephron lifted his brow. You mean to threaten war with Mir if they ally with Lys? If they turn from us, they are lost already, Melisandre replied. We will remind them that the Lord of Light holds dominion, not the princes of Lys. Mokori's obsidian eyes flickered. And if Mir still refuses? A long moment passed. Melisandre's gaze slid across the map. She saw roads leading to Mir, the farmland and hills that separated the two cities, the potential choke points along the way. Then she looked to the sea, imagining Lys's warships. Then we march, she said simply. We bring them into the Red Empire by force. When Mir falls, Lys will see the futility of resistance. Miranda's face paled. War on two fronts. Are we ready for that? Melisandre's voice was firm. We have more soldiers than ever before, and our faith unifies them. The Lord of Light is with us. The illusions we command will sow terror in enemy lines. If Mir's people see us as unstoppable, they might overthrow their magisters themselves. But we cannot wait. Each day we linger, Lys grows bolder. And so the die was cast. A final ultimatum was dispatched to Mir, carried by a stoic priest who had served R'hllor for decades. In the letter, Melisandre proclaimed that Mir must openly declare for the Red Empire, expel any Lyseni envoys, and permit a permanent garrison of Flameborn within the city. If they complied, Mir's leaders would retain local authority under the watchful eye of the Red Faith. If they refused, the Red Empire would march within a fortnight. The tension in Volantis coiled like a steel spring. Soldiers drilled relentlessly. Blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge swords, spears, and breastplates adorned with a stylized flame sigil. The new war galleys in the harbor stood ready, albeit with skeleton crews. Though lacking the naval might of Lys, they could at least patrol near the shore. Rumors flew wild among the populace. Some predicted swift victory. Others warned that the city was about to plunge into a nightmare of bloodshed. Melisandre continued her nightly sermons, fervently declaring that the Lord of Light would guide them to triumph. During one such sermon, as hundreds of faithful clustered around a towering pyre, Melisandre felt a subtle pang in her heart, the memory of Stannis Baratheon, the man whom she had once thought to be Azor Ahai reborn. She remembered how she had promised him victories that never fully materialized, how the illusions and shadowy arts had carried them only so far. Doubt flickered for an instant beneath her stern composure. Yet she pressed on, reminding herself that this time, she was not a mere advisor to a king. She was leading an entire movement, backed by the largest Red Temple in the world. She had new knowledge, new allies, and had learned from her mistakes. This time, she assured herself, the flames would not fail. At last, the Myrish priest returned, his face ashen. In the temple courtyard, he handed Melisandre a sealed letter. A hush fell among the red priests and soldiers gathered to witness. Melisandre broke the wax seal, imprinted with Mir's official crest, and read, "The magisters of Mir reject your ultimatum. Our city cherishes its freedom and shall not surrender it to any foreign god or empire. We remain open to peaceful trade, but we will not bow. Should Volantis march on Mir, you will find our walls well defended and our allies prepared. Turn back from the path of conquest, lest your bright flame be extinguished in the fields before our gates." Silence lingered, broken only by the crackle of nearby torches. Melisandre closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. Then, with measured deliberation, she held the parchment above a brazier. It caught fire, curling into black flakes that drifted upward in a swirl of smoke. She spoke, her voice resonating with certainty. They have chosen darkness over light. We will not let them snuff out the fire we've ignited. Let them man their walls. Let them summon Lys and any others. We shall bring the dawn of the Red Empire to them, whether they welcome it or not." Thus, the drums of war began to beat in Volantis. Over the next days, columns of soldiers mustered in the city squares, readying for a campaign northward. A portion of the garrison remained behind to keep order, but thousands of foot soldiers, cavalry, and priests prepared to depart. Wagons loaded with supplies, siege equipment, and all manner of arms stretched along the main roads. The city seemed gripped in a fervor reminiscent of ancient Volantine expansions, except now, the impetus was not mercantile ambition or aristocratic pride, but religious conviction. Over these preparations, Bonero looked on with a mixture of concern and resignation, offering prayers for victory. Mokori assisted with planning, her knowledge of sorceress wards possibly critical in facing any hidden defenses Mir might employ. Ephron led the newly trained formations, barking orders, ensuring discipline. Miranda tended to the spiritual needs of the troops, hearing their confessions, reassuring them that Lawloress light would guide them through the chaos. Finally, the day came. At dawn, Melisandre stood atop the highest step of the temple, gazing upon the assembled ranks of the Flameborn. They formed an imposing sight, row upon row of red-clad soldiers, some carrying spears tipped with steel shaped like tongues of fire, others bearing curved swords that glinted in the sunrise. Priests in red and gold vestments walked among them, chanting, anointing foreheads with oil that shimmered in the light. At their head rose a banner depicting a crimson sun overlaid with black flames, the emblem Melisandre had personally chosen as the sigil of the Red Empire. She descended the steps, moving slowly among the ranks. Her presence caused helmets to clatter as men and women knelt in reverence. She raised her arms, and her voice carried over the hush. "Children of the light, today we march to bring truth to those who cling to old shadows. Do not fear death, for the flame is eternal. Fight with courage and with faith. The darkness trembles before us. The Lord of Light is with us." A thunderous roar went up. Banners lifted. Drums pounded in a steady rhythm. The great gates of Volantis opened, allowing the host to spill forth like a crimson tide. Melisandre rode at the front, astride a dappled mare with braided mane, flanked by Ephron and Mokori. The wind carried the tang of salt and dust. Ahead lay the open roads through farmland, then rolling hills, and eventually the territories near Mir. In her mind's eye, Melisandre pictured the city's walls, the scorpions and archers arrayed atop them, the mercenaries who might lurk behind their gates. She imagined how the illusions of R'hllor would ripple across the battlefield, sowing panic among the defenders. She told herself that the righteous cause would prevail, that thousands of Myrish souls would be freed from the tyranny of false lords and introduced to the one true God. But beneath that resolute surface, a voice in her heart whispered, "Once this path is taken, there is no turning back." If victory came, it would be glorious. If defeat came, the Red Empire might crumble in its infancy, dashing her dream of uniting the world under Lawloress flame. She silenced the voice with a firm thought. It was too late for doubt. The fire she had kindled now roared, and she would see it through or burn with it. Onward the army marched. Dust rose in clouds under the shuffle of boots and hooves, swirling around them like a living shroud. At night, they camped around enormous bonfires, singing hymns to the Lord of Light. Melisandre would walk among them, distributing small blessings, urging them not to fear the battles ahead. The flicker of the flames made her red hair glow as if lit from within, and in those moments, many soldiers truly believed they looked upon a divine emissary. Even the few skeptics who lingered in the ranks dared not voice dissent. Her illusions, subtle or dramatic, maintained an air of the supernatural. Whenever men or women began to falter, she would conjure a harmless swirl of sparks or cause the flames in the braziers to roar upward in a sudden flare. A tempered fear. Scouts reported that Mir was mobilizing at the border, constructing wooden fortifications and stationing cavalry patrols across the farmland. The rumor of Lyseni mercenaries in the area spread like wildfire, though no one had yet confirmed which company they might have hired. Some whispered the Golden Company was inbound, others named lesser sellsword bands. The tension in the Red Empire's columns crackled as they approached the frontier. Soon, the farmland gave way to gently rolling terrain, dotted with orchards and small hamlets. Myrish archers sometimes harried the vanguard, loosing arrows from cover before retreating. Each time, the Red Empire's cavalry gave chase, but Myr's forces knew the land and avoided pitched battles. This was not a grand clash, yet more a probing dance, each side testing the other's resolve. It wasn't until a week into the campaign that the first real engagement took shape. A Myrish force, perhaps a few thousand strong, had taken position on a low ridge near a hamlet called Elinar's Grove, blocking the Red Empire's advance along the main road. Scouts estimated they possessed cavalry, some infantry, and possibly siege weapons. At dawn, Melisandre called her commanders together. Standing over a rough map sketched in the dirt, Ephron proposed a direct assault up the slope, while some of their own cavalry circled to flank. Mokori cautioned that the Myrish might have prepared traps or illusions of their own if any local shadowbinders had joined them. Melisandre listened calmly, then concluded they must strike decisively, demonstrating the unstoppable ferocity of the Lord of Light. A thunderous victory would ripple through Myr's armies, perhaps deterring them from further resistance. The Red Empire's host formed up in battle lines. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, priests behind the ranks, ready to raise morale and tend to the wounded. Melisandre and her personal guard took a position at the center front, with Ephron commanding the right flank. The morning sun crept over the ridge. From below, they could see Myrish banners fluttering, and the glint of steel as archers prepared to loose. Drums pounded, horns blew, soldiers tensed for the charge. Melisandre raised a hand high. Fire blazed from a torch, and she cried out in High Valyrian, "For Lawler! Forward!" The infantry surged. Myrish archers fired a hail of arrows, some clattering off shields, others striking flesh. Screams punctured the roar. Yet Melisandre's illusions sprang into effect. Swirling embers seemed to emanate around the Red Empire's front ranks, causing some Myrish archers to gasp, as though a curtain of flame had flared up to obscure their targets. In truth, the illusions provided no physical protection, but the momentary shock disrupted Myr's arrow volleys, giving the Red soldiers a fraction of a second to close the distance. Then, with a shuddering crash, the front lines met. Shields slammed, spears thrust. Screams and the clang of steel mingled with the acrid scent of blood. Up on the ridge, Myrish spearmen tried to hold firm, but the fervor of the Red Empire troops pushed them back step by step. Priests chanted from behind, urging the fighters onward, promising divine favor. Some among the Red ranks claimed they felt an invisible heat surging through them, lending them strength. Whether it was faith, adrenaline, or a touch of Melisandre's sorcery, it worked. The Myrish front line began to buckle. Still, the outcome was far from certain. Myrish cavalry thundered down from the flank, attempting to break the Red Empire's right. Ephron's cavalry met them in a cacophony of horseflesh and steel, and for a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to swirl into chaos. Dust rose in choking clouds, half concealing the carnage. Melisandre remained in the thick of it, not exactly leading the charge but standing just behind the front, chanting words of power. She extended her hands, conjuring illusions of flickering wraiths formed of flame that appeared to dance among the Myrish lines. Some Myrish soldiers screamed that they were being set upon by fiery demons, flailing in panic. Others tried to rally, cursing the Witch Queen. Suddenly, a Myrish captain on horseback charged through the melee, heading straight for Melisandre. She turned, hearing the thunder of hooves. Ephron, spotting the threat from across the lines, shouted a warning. Too far away to intercept, he could only watch. The captain's blade arced toward Melisandre's exposed flank. For an instant, it seemed she might be cut down, her illusions no shield against cold steel. But Mokori appeared, as if stepping from a wisp of smoke. She thrust a short, wicked-looking blade at the horse's flank, causing the beast to rear and throw its rider. The Myrish captain tumbled into the churned mud. With a graceful pivot, Mokori followed up, plunging her blade into the man's throat. The attacker twitched once and lay still. Melisandre exhaled, locking eyes with Mokori in silent gratitude. Then the moment passed, and the battle surged around them again. For another hour, the two armies struggled, the fate of Elenar's grove uncertain. Slowly, methodically, the Red Empire's discipline and fanaticism prevailed. Myr's lines fragmented. Men began to break and flee, pursued by cavalry that Ephron had rallied. A portion of Myr's force managed to retreat in good order, but they had lost the ridge. The hamlet below fell under Red Empire control, and the Myrish dead and wounded littered the fields in the hundreds. After securing the area, Melisandre ordered the wounded to be treated. Red priests moved among them, providing rudimentary care. Some Myrish prisoners were taken. As twilight fell, the victors lit a great bonfire atop the ridge. The bodies of fallen Red soldiers were burned ceremoniously, that their spirits might ascend into Lawloress embrace. The captured Myrish soldiers, meanwhile, were given a stark choice: join the Red Empire and renounce their city's rebellion, or face the same pyre. Many, terrified and demoralized, chose conversion. Others spat curses at Melisandre and were cast into the flames. The screams echoed across the darkening sky, a haunting prelude to the fates yet to unfold. Over that ghastly chorus, Melisandre stood, the firelight painting her features in red and gold. She reminded herself that each sacrifice brought the realm one step closer to the dawn she envisioned. A unified world, cleansed of the old petty powers, bound together in a single faith strong enough to stand against the creeping shadows. Through the choking odor of burning flesh, she sensed the judgment of onlookers. Some within her own ranks stared at the horrifying spectacle, possibly questioning the righteousness of such cruelty. She lifted her chin, determined to show no weakness. The Red Empire was not for the faint of heart. If Myr insisted on resisting, this was the price. In the days that followed, the Red Empire's columns continued their advance. The countryside was mostly deserted, the peasants having fled at the rumor of approaching war. A few villages offered no resistance, though the local lords or bailiffs had vanished. Occasionally, hidden archers harassed the rear guard. Everywhere, the message was clear: Myr would not capitulate easily. Still, news of the defeat at Elenar's grove spread quickly, undermining morale among Myrish defenders. By the time Melisandre's host reached the outskirts of Myr itself, they found the walls guarded but many outlying settlements abandoned. A ring of rudimentary fortifications encircled the city, and Myrish banners snapped in the wind. Some rumored that Lyseni mercenaries were within those walls. Others claimed the Myrish had pinned all hope on the city's famed crossbowmen, who could rain bolts with deadly accuracy from high parapets. Melisandre set camp several miles away, preparing for a siege. The question of how to breach Myr's defenses loomed large. Assaulting directly would cost countless lives, and the city's crossbows could wreak havoc. Ephron favored constructing siege towers, while Mokori argued for more subtle measures, perhaps infiltrating the city with illusions or bribing a portion of the guard. Meanwhile, Melisandre wondered if the sight of a massive Red Empire force at the gates might spark an internal revolt among Myr's populace, especially if the Red priests there had any hidden sway. She sent secret messages to her contacts inside the city, urging them to sabotage the defenses, promising that the new order would spare them if they helped. Days stretched into a tense stalemate. Myr's defenders showed no sign of surrender. Occasionally, a Myrish raiding party attacked the Red Empire's supply lines by night, vanishing into the darkness when pursued. Morale among the besiegers remained high in the early phase, bolstered by zeal. But the longer the wait, the more men began to wonder if they would starve or sicken in the fields rather than see the glory of conquest. In the gloom of one such night, Melisandre stood before a brazier in her personal tent, chanting softly. Mokori stood beside her, eyes half closed. Ephron paced at the tent's entrance, restless. A map of Myr lay on a simple wooden table, weighed down by a dagger. Each flicker of the brazier's flame cast shifting shapes across the map's parchment, as though the city's walls moved in sinister ways. Mokori's voice dripped with quiet urgency. The shadows around Mir are restless. There is something within those walls, a power that does not belong to the Red Faith. I sense a darkness that might twist illusions into nightmares. Proceed with caution. Melisandre's eyes narrowed. Some form of blood magic? Or a sorcerer allied with the Myrish leadership? I cannot say, Mokori murmured, but the flame warns us not to rush blindly. They have wards in place. Our illusions might falter if we rely on them too heavily. Ephron exhaled, frustration evident in his stance. We can't sit here forever. Sooner or later, Lys will come, or the city's defenders will grow bold. We have to make a move. Melisandre's gaze lifted from the brazier. We will. At dawn, we begin constructing siege works. Let the Myrish see that we intend to take their city by force if they do not open their gates. Meanwhile, we will attempt infiltration through other means. We have not yet tested the full extent of our allies inside. Ephron nodded slowly. I'll see to it. When he left, Melisandre and Mokori remained, the brazier's flame dwindling to embers. The night felt heavy, as though a leaden shroud lay over the camp. Melisandre inhaled, feeling a tremor of doubt. She steadied herself, reminding herself that any such doubt was a tool of darkness. She was the Lord's chosen instrument. She must not waver. Dawn came. The Red Empire's siege works began in earnest. Tall wooden frames for towers, wide trenches, earthen ramps. An array of engineering feats slowly took shape under the watchful eye of Mir's crossbowmen, who occasionally loosed bolts at the laborers. Casualties were sustained, but the lines of priests and soldiers refused to break. There were smaller skirmishes, especially after the Myrish tried a sortie to burn the half-built towers. Ephron's cavalry repelled them, though at a cost in blood. All the while, tension soared. When it became clear that Mir had no intention of surrendering soon, Melisandre escalated. She ordered catapults be built, or at least large trebuchets that could fling flaming projectiles into the city. The aim was not just to break walls but to sow terror. If the flames from these war machines lit Mir's rooftops, perhaps the city would descend into chaos, prompting an internal coup that would open the gates. As the siege ground on, rumors spread through the Red Empire's camp of Lyseni ships sighted along the coast, possibly offloading mercenaries who would march inland to reinforce Mir. Messengers were sent back to Volantis, requesting additional forces to guard against a flank attack. Meanwhile, disease began to rear its head among the besiegers. Food was plentiful enough for the moment, but unsanitary conditions in camp took their toll. Priests tried to quell it, distributing concoctions of herbs and chanting prayers. Some soldiers recovered, attributing their survival to the Lord of Light. Others died in delirium, cursing or praising Melisandre's name in equal measure. Then, late one night, a hooded figure arrived at the perimeter of the Red Empire's lines, claiming to be a Myrish citizen loyal to the Red Faith. After some hesitation, he was brought before Melisandre in her command tent. By torchlight, he lowered his hood, revealing a lined face and weary eyes. He introduced himself as Jellon, a minor functionary in one of Mir's lesser guilds. I bring a message from those within Mir who wish for your victory, Jellon said, voice shaking. The city suffers under the tyranny of the Magisters and the threat of mercenaries from Lys. We are ready to rise up, but we need a sign, something to show that the Red Empire will triumph if we act. Melisandre's gaze flicked to Mokori, who studied Jellon with an inscrutable expression. Then she nodded. What would encourage your people to overthrow the Magisters? Jellon swallowed hard. We have heard stories of your power, miracles with flame, illusions that drive men mad. If you could show that power in the heart of Mir, some spectacle that rattles the Magister's confidence, my compatriots could incite a revolt. If the city's defenders see the Magisters lose the god's favor, they may open the gates to you. Melisandre considered this request. How would I manifest such a spectacle within the city walls, when my illusions and presence are here, outside? There is a building near the city center, an abandoned temple once dedicated to some forgotten deity. My group can give you secret passage beneath the walls if you dare. It's risky, but if you can stage one of your fire miracles in that old temple, word will spread like wildfire. The people's fear of the Magisters will break. A hush followed. Mokori stepped forward, her voice low. It could be a trap. Jellan looked genuinely distressed. It is no trap. I risk my life coming here. If the Magisters learn of my treachery, I am dead. I beg you to believe me. Melisandre felt the heavy weight of possibility. A direct assault on Mir might cost thousands of lives. If Jellan spoke truth, infiltration and a well-timed spectacle could spark a rebellion from within. That might bring the city to its knees swiftly. Yet, it was perilous for her to step away from the army's protective lines. If she fell, the Red Empire might crumble. After a long pause, she turned to Mokori. I will do it. With a small guard, we'll go beneath the walls. The risk is great, but so is the reward. The people must see me in the heart of Mir, untouched by the city's defenders. Mokori bowed her head, shadows flickering across her face. Then I will accompany you. We must prepare wards against any dark sorcery that might be waiting. Despite Ephron's vehement objections, Melisandre insisted on leading the infiltration. She left him in command of the siege lines, instructing him to prepare for a final assault if she did not return by dawn 2 days hence. In that event, he was to send all forces forward, no matter the cost. Ephron's jaw clenched, but he saluted, acknowledging her authority. On the eve of departure, Melisandre moved through the camp, silent as a specter, gathering the small group who would accompany her. A handful of elite soldiers and priests skilled in illusions or stealth. Jellan waited at the northern edge, trembling but resolute. Under cover of darkness, they slipped into a hidden tunnel that Jellan revealed behind a thicket near a dry creek bed. The passage smelled of damp earth and decay. Torches flickered, revealing old stone steps leading downward. The group descended, hearts pounding. Above, Mir's walls stood thick and vigilant, its watchfires glimmering in the night. Yet no alarm sounded. They waded through knee-deep water in places, forced to crouch and shuffle through narrow sections. Mokori murmured incantations to keep their torches from flickering too brightly and to hush the sound of their footsteps. After what felt like hours, the tunnel sloped upward. Jellan listened intently at a rough stone hatch, then slowly lifted it. Cool air drifted in, carrying the faint tang of burning oil. They emerged into the remains of an old crypt, its columns cracked. A battered statue of a forgotten god lay toppled in the corner. The party moved cautiously up a flight of stairs that ended at a rusted iron door. Jellan pressed a key into the lock, wincing at the squeak. Beyond the door, a wide hallway stretched into darkness. They were inside the old temple. According to Jellan, it was mostly abandoned except for the occasional Myrish guard detail. Their plan was to proceed to the main sanctuary, light an immense fire, and perform illusions so grand that watchers throughout Mir would see the glow and hear the chanting. Loyalists within the city would spread the rumor that the Red Woman had appeared at the temple's heart. If all went well, the temple's location, on high ground near the Magister's quarter, would let the spectacle be visible for miles. But they had not gone 50 paces before torches flared at the far end of the hallway. A group of armed Myrish guards came into view. They shouted, leveling spears, evidently tipped off or simply unlucky enough to patrol here at the wrong time. The Red Empire infiltrators drew weapons, cursing under their breath. Melisandre raised a hand, conjuring a swirl of firelight that danced across the corridor's walls, causing the guards to hesitate. Mokori whispered in a guttural tone, and the shadows along the ceiling twisted, momentarily forming shapes that loomed like monstrous silhouettes behind the Red Empire soldiers. The Myrish guards faltered, frightened by this eerie display. One tried to hurl a spear, but it missed wildly, clattering on stone. Seizing the advantage, the Red soldiers rushed forward. Blades flashed, and the guards were cut down. Silence settled, broken only by the ragged breathing of the infiltrators. They pressed on quickly, knowing more patrols might come. Through winding corridors, they picked their way to the main sanctuary. En route, they dispatched a few lone sentries with ruthless efficiency, or frightened them into fleeing with illusions. At last, they reached a pair of massive, rotting wooden doors. Jellon pushed one open, revealing a cavernous chamber lined with smashed pews. At the far end, a dais that once held an idol of the forgotten god now stood empty. Cracks in the domed ceiling let moonlight filter in, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. Jellon pointed to a large, sunken pit at the center of the sanctuary. That's where they used to hold animal sacrifices. If we fill it with kindling and oil, it'll burn bright. Mokori's eyes flicked around the perimeter. We must work quickly. If the city's guard musters, we'll be trapped. The group began gathering broken timber and debris, piling it into the pit. One soldier produced oil flasks, splashing them liberally over the wood. Melisandre stood at the dais, her heart hammering. This moment felt like a turning point for the entire campaign, and perhaps for the destiny of the Red Empire. If they succeeded, Myr might break from within. If they failed, she and her companions could be slaughtered, dooming the siege to stagnation or defeat. When at last the pit was drenched and piled high, Melisandre nodded to Mokori. They both descended into the pit, standing amid the debris. Jellon and the soldiers retreated to the edges. Melisandre raised her arms, chanting in a voice that echoed off the ancient stone walls. She spoke in the old Valyrian tongue, calling upon R'hllor to watch over this place, to cleanse it of the vestiges of false gods. Mokori joined the chant, her voice weaving harmonies both haunting and powerful. As they prayed, Melisandre felt the now familiar warmth stirring in her chest. A surge of energy, partly from faith, partly from her own practiced illusions. She opened her eyes and saw the wood at her feet begin to smolder. Sparks danced in the air, multiplying. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the entire pit ignited, flames leaping up around the two priestesses. The watchers at the edge gasped. Even Jellon seemed stunned, certain that they would be consumed. But Melisandre and Mokori stood untouched in the heart of the inferno, illusions warping the flames so that they formed a swirling vortex around them. From outside, it appeared as if the fire itself bowed to their command. Crimson light filled the sanctuary. Smoke rose in thick coils through the cracked dome, billowing into the night sky above Myr. The glow pulsed, flickering on the old walls like a living, breathing thing. Melisandre lifted her face to the heavens, letting the heat embrace her. She chanted a prophecy of victory, her voice carrying across the city beyond. The illusions amplified her words, so that they thundered through the broken dome. Mokori added her own incantations, fueling a spectacle of dancing silhouettes that seemed to reach out from the flames, as if monstrous or divine presences were gathering to witness the act. In the nearby streets, the people of Myr saw the beams of fire shooting from the ancient temple, heard the eerie chanting echo through the darkness. Some cowered indoors, believing a demonic invasion was underway. Others ran outside, transfixed by the sight. Word raced from mouth to mouth. The Red Woman is here. She has appeared in the heart of Myr. Resistance fighters, secretly loyal to the Red Faith, took this as their signal. They emerged from hiding, attacking guard posts or inciting mobs against the Magisters. The city, already on edge, tilted toward bedlam. Some of the Magisters' guards rushed to the temple, but illusions of monstrous shadows at the doors and windows barred their way, sowing panic. The bold ones who tried to charge inside faced the red soldiers lying in wait. Within minutes, the old sanctuary became a slaughterhouse for any who dared oppose them. Fear ripped through Myr's defensive lines, and in many districts, the crowd began rioting, some blaming the Magisters for bringing this supernatural wrath upon them, others cheering for the Red Empire's salvation. The confusion escalated with every passing moment. Sensing that the city verged on chaos, Melisandre ended the spectacle with a final burst of flame that roared high into the dome, scorching it black. Then she signaled their group to withdraw. They had done what they came to do. The infiltration team ducked back into corridors, using the same route to return. Along the way, they heard distant screams, the clash of steel, the pounding of feet on cobblestones. Mir was tearing itself apart. They emerged from the tunnel into the open fields just before dawn. A watchful Red Empire picket greeted them, relief clear on their faces. Word of the monstrous fire in Mir's heart had already reached the siege lines. The city's defenders were in disarray, many retreating to the inner walls or throwing down their weapons outright. The next day, after savage street fighting, a faction of Mir's population flung open one of the gates, letting the Red Empire's army pour in. Ephron led the charge, pushing through to the Magister's district. Pockets of mercenaries fought bitterly, but the tide was too strong. Mir's forces crumbled from within. By sunset, the Magisters had either fled, been killed, or surrendered at the foot of the old guild towers. Mir was in flames, literal and figurative. Melisandre entered the city on horseback, greeted by throngs of newly converted citizens who hailed her as the deliverer. Bodies lined the streets, though some in the crowd tried to hide the horror with joyous cheers. Once again, the Red Empire's banner was raised over a conquered capital. Another city had fallen to the fervor of R'hllor. In the days that followed, order was ruthlessly enforced. Priests and soldiers scoured the city for any remaining pockets of resistance. The new administration promised an end to the corruption of the Magisters, the dawn of a more just rule under the Lord of Light. The people, exhausted by war and terror, mostly complied, especially when they saw that open defiance meant a swift trip to the pyres. Similar to Volantis, a transition plan for any slaves or thralls was announced. Local guilds were reorganized under temple oversight. The city's famed crossbowmakers were induced to swear loyalty, ensuring the Red Empire gained an even greater stockpile of advanced weaponry. Some parts of Mir were ravaged by looting and fires set during the chaos, but Melisandre insisted on swift reconstruction, employing thralls for the labor. Public works projects sprang up under the temple's direction, giving the people a tangible sense that a new era had begun. After the dust settled, she learned that a portion of Lyseni mercenaries had arrived too late to save Mir. They were camped miles to the south, uncertain whether to advance or retreat now that the city had effectively fallen. Emboldened by victory, Melisandre sent them a message, an offer of amnesty and generous pay if they joined the Red Empire's legions. Some mercenaries accepted, others melted away into the countryside or attempted to rejoin Lys. The threat from Lys did not vanish, but for the moment, they had lost their chance to form a united front with Mir. Standing on a balcony of what had once been a Magister's mansion, Melisandre surveyed Mir's skyline. Smoke still drifted from scorched rooftops, but red banners now fluttered atop watchtowers. In the distance, she could see peasants hauling rubble, guided by armed soldiers. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment's respite. Another city bent to her will. The Red Empire expanded. Yet deep within her, she felt no elation, only a kind of grim resolve. This war, she sensed, was just beginning. Lys, Tyrosh, perhaps Pentos might rise in opposition. And beyond them still lay the vastness of Essos, not to mention Westeros across the sea. Her illusions had carried the day in Mir, but she could not rely on the same trick forever. Enemies would adapt or discover new ways to combat her sorcery. The shadow glimpsed by Mokori still loomed. Something dark and hungry might yet stir in the wake of such widespread bloodshed. But for now, Mir was hers, or rather, R'hllor's. She lifted her gaze to the horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of copper and vermilion, as though reflecting the flames that had consumed the city. She prayed softly, "Lord of light, grant me the strength to see this through. Let our blaze burn away all that is false, that the world might not perish in the darkness." A faint breeze carried the chant of distant priests from below, echoing in the battered streets. Slowly, Melisandre turned from the railing, heading back inside to confer with her advisors. More decisions awaited: whom to appoint as Mir's governor, how to integrate the city's crafts into the Red Empire's war machine, and how best to prepare for Lys's inevitable response. Step by step, city by city, her Red Empire took shape, forging a chain of faithful strongholds that might one day encircle the known world. She reminded herself that every act of violence, every pyre, every family torn apart, was, in her view, a necessary step to save humanity from a greater horror. Was it truly righteous? Or was it a path of hubris and blood leading to a desolation no less grim than the nightmares she sought to avert? The flames whispered no answer. They only burned, hot and hungry, devouring any who stood in their way. And so Melisandre pressed on, aflame with purpose, determined to carve out her red empire until no corner of the earth could deny the light.